When it comes to video game movie adaptations, I don't think I'm the first to say that Hollywood hasn't been very kind. And by that I mean Hollywood has no damn clue how to do it right. Hell, for all I know, there may be no way of properly doing it justice. In the 90s, when Hollywood first tried to experiment with Super Mario Bros., video games just didn't have very cinematic stories. So the filmmakers took as many liberties as they felt they needed. I honestly couldn't tell you how to make a live-action film about two Brooklyn plumbers who get sucked into a magical world where all the inhabitants have been turned into bricks and the bad guy's a giant dragon. Actually, with some imagination, now that I think about it, that kind of sounds plausible. And maybe had Hollywood made that movie, we wouldn't have gotten the mega disaster that nearly ruined the careers of Dennis Hopper, Bob Hoskins, and John Leguizamo.
And Super Mario Brothers sucked. It did.
Today, video games are doing a much better job of converging both mediums, using cinematic techniques to their advantage in order to tell fantastic stories, but also creating memorable gaming experiences. I think games are more successful at doing this because the interactivity adds a whole new layer of stimulation that movies simply can't achieve, aside from the animated menus on a DVD, and those have pretty much gone by the wayside. But that also poses a problem for today's batch of video game to movie adaptations. Although the few titles that do make it to the big screen are slightly better than what we got 20 years ago, and don't get me wrong, most of them are still pretty bad. When one comes along that manages to be decent, they're typically based on a game that already has a pretty epic storyline. So what happens? The movie becomes a heavily truncated retelling of a story that its fan base is already familiar with. I guess you can't win for losing, can you, Hollywood? Once in a while, a movie comes along that looks like the filmmakers at least tried to follow the basic formula of the game. Sometimes it's moderately successful. Look, I don't think Mortal Kombat is a great film, but it comes as close to its source material as it allows. For a game about a bunch of douchebag American martial artists doing battle against supernatural ninjas from another dimension, the movie does its job. I think that movie kind of worked because the video game, at the time anyway, more or less resembled real life. The game used digitized graphics and the characters resembled real people, so it was easier to translate to the screen. But what about when a game doesn't simulate the real world? A game like, say, Street Fighter 2. The live-action Street Fighter movie, as bad as it is, kind of looks like they tried to get away with a decent rendition of the characters. I can't help laughing every time I see the character of Blanca make an appearance, but it's not all Hollywood's fault. I just don't understand why Hollywood didn't consider doing an animated film that closely resembled the game. Whenever the conversation of video game movies comes up, Street Fighter usually finds its way into the mix. So many people have reviewed this colossal shit heap over the years, but you know what? I've never seen anyone talk about the good Street Fighter movie. There's a good Street Fighter movie, you ask? Yes, it does exist, it is animated, and it came from Japan. I remember back in the mid-90s coming across this movie at my local video store. At the time, I wasn't a big Street Fighter fan, so I passed it up. Eventually, I caught the movie on cable, and I couldn't believe how entertaining it was. Having very little knowledge of the source material, I felt like it captured the feel of the video game while including all of the essential characters. Sure, some of them only have minor cameos, but they served the story well. Hollywood should have watched this film and took notes, because this is how you do a video game movie. What, must be excluded from the conversation because it's animated? Just a little thing about anime. I'm not a huge rabid anime fan. I don't seek out anime, I hardly even check out the anime section at the video store. But as someone who loves movies, when I come across one that happens to be anime, I'm typically impressed. I often find myself asking why Hollywood can't do films in that style. Today, there's so much out there it'll make your head spin, and if you're new to anime, I couldn't tell you where to begin. I've seen a handful myself, but I am not a connoisseur. But I will say that out of everything I've seen, Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, or just Street Fighter 2 movie, as it's called in Japan, is one of the best. I don't just mean it's one of the best video game to movie adaptations because in that regard, it blows all of Hollywood's failed attempts out of the water. But it's one of the best animated films I've ever seen. And as a movie that's adapted from a fighting game, that's saying something. If you're familiar with the game, then you already know how this plays out. An evil dictator named M. Bison runs a worldwide crime syndicate called Shadow Law. He scours the world looking for street fighters who he can recruit into his organization, his prime target being a mysterious Japanese fighter, Ryu, because of his powerful skills. When he can't locate Ryu, Bison instead goes after Ken Masters, an American fighter whose power matches Ryu's in almost every way because the two fighters trained at the same school. If you're not familiar with the game's storyline, this explains why the two fighters always have the same moveset. The story also follows several recognizable characters who are in some way or another connected to Bison. Chun-Li, who actually plays a big role in the film, heads an investigation to take down Shadow Law. We discover that Bison was responsible for killing her father, so of course she has a personal vendetta against him. She recruits the help of Air Force Captain Guile, who also seeks revenge against Bison for the death of his partner.
What's wrong, Guile? Thinking about your friend I killed?
So those are the primary characters, with the rest of the Street Fighter cast being relegated to cameos. But these aren't just characters who sit in the background waving at the camera for simple fan service. With a few exceptions, they actually fight each other. Imagine that, a movie called Street Fighter where people actually fight. One example would be the Blanca and Zangief fight, which is short but replicates the arcade matchup perfectly. The fight happens during a random event in Las Vegas with a cheering crowd in attendance, which is the kind of thing you'd see in the video game. Ryu and Ken also have several encounters with popular Street Fighter characters as they wander the world in search of a good fight. The most badass fight, in my opinion, is where Chun-Li fights Vega in her New York apartment. Both characters take a massive beating, and it's bloodier than you'd expect from a game based off of Street Fighter. This scene is also famous because of Chun-Li appearing nude in the shower, which honestly seems out of place for this kind of film. I'm not just talking about the nudity, but the music and the way the scene is set up feels like something you'd see in a slasher movie. As Chun-Li showers, the camera pans around the corner, putting us inside the POV of her soon-to-be attacker. It's the one scene that's kind of unsettling, but it also makes the movie that much more memorable. Let's talk about the nudity for a minute. While unnecessary, I'm glad that the filmmakers decided to make the movie for a more mature audience, despite the video game targeting a vastly younger crowd. However, the version of the film I saw growing up actually censored out the nudity, along with a lot of the swearing that appeared in the original Japanese cut. Even the so-called unrated DVD that I owned for years censored this scene. It wasn't until years later that I discovered the uncut version of the film online. Back in the 90s, anime was still kind of trickling onto American shores, and American audiences weren't used to seeing adult-style animation. Even today, when I tell someone a movie's animated, they act like they're about to see a Disney movie. Hollywood has released some R-rated animated movies in the past, don't get me wrong, but the number of mature animated films in Japan far outnumbers what we have here. Today, it makes sense to include the nudity and the violence because anime, let's face it, has a much broader appeal. But for those not expecting to see one of the franchise's most iconic characters topless in the shower, well, there you go. It all boils down to an epic battle on top of a mountain, 3 against 3, with Ken and Ryu finally going up against the man himself, M. Bison, in a battle to the death. The whole film echoes the game perfectly, not just in its animation style, which closely mirrors the style of the game, but in its storytelling. It knows how to balance a wide roster of characters without making the story convoluted, opting to focus on a few important characters, but still leaving plenty of room for the kinds of fights you'd see in the game, and making them exciting. The soundtrack, in the American version of the film at least, really enhances the mood, getting you pumped up to see the rest of the story unfold. And when it ends, it leaves you wanting more. So much more. Why has no one in Hollywood watched this film and said, hey, you know what? Why don't we try doing it like that? Why does every movie have to be done with live action? Look at all of our childhood cartoons being translated into lame live-action movies. Why is it like this now? Animated movies are making a killing for Disney and Pixar, so why can't we see more of them for the properties we love? Can you imagine a Transformers or a Ninja Turtles movie done in this style? And this movie has a reported budget of just $6 million. Even in 1995, that wasn't a lot of money to make a movie. And it made $16 million when it was released in Japan. Go figure. There were other animated Street Fighter films, such as Street Fighter Alpha the movie, Street Fighter Alpha Generations, and Street Fighter 4, which is more of a companion piece to the game, but it exists. And none of them achieve the greatness that this one does, so unless you're extremely curious, I'd say just stick with this one. Apparently there was an American animated series for Street Fighter 2 as well. I haven't seen it, but if you want a really awesome TV series, you can't go wrong with Street Fighter 2 V. It was directed by the same guy who did the animated film, has the same level of energy, and the English dub uses a lot of the same voice actors. Plus, as a show, you get to spend more time with some of the characters they skimped out on the film. The characters all represent younger versions of themselves, so I'm not sure if this is actually a prequel to the film or if it's set in its own continuity, but either way, it's a blast to watch. If you finish the movie and you want a little more Street Fighter action, then here you go. One more thing I want to talk about is the awesome Blu-ray release of the film. I just picked this up and it is hands down the definitive version of the film. not only does it look fantastic in HD, but it's finally the uncut Japanese version with several dubs to choose from. You can watch the watered-down PG-13 version, I'm not sure why you'd want to, but there you go, as well as the American unrated cut, the Japanese unrated cut, even the UK cut, which actually drops some F-bombs.
Bison, I'm gonna rip your lousy heart out, you filthy bastard! Bison, I'll rip your fucking heart out, you filthy bastard!
Another nice feature is being able to watch the English dub of the film with the original Japanese soundtrack, which used a more J-pop selection and gives the film a slightly different feel. I've watched part of the movie this way, and while it changed my experience a little bit, both versions are a blast. There's also a nice selection of bonus features, which I find is usually missing from anime DVDs these days, hell, most Blu-rays even. But my favorite bonus feature is the one that actually gives you a history of all of the different cuts of the film. I rarely see that, so that was an interesting surprise. Street Fighter II proves that video game movies can be done right. Just don't give them to Hollywood because obviously in 20 years, they haven't figured it out. This one is a testament to what video game movies should be.